On my return to the front late one morning in June, I took up my regular observation post a few feet to the right of a soldier manning one of the powerful new MG-42 machine guns. Because the MG-42's exceptionally high rate of fire made it impossible to differentiate the shooting of its individual bullets, the machine gun produced a very distinctive noise, more closely resembling a cloth being ripped than a weapon being fired. Yet, perhaps its greatest asset was that the weapon would nearly always operate reliably, even in muddy conditions like those at the Volkov. As was commonly the case, the posted infantryman was unfamiliar to me, and we engaged in little conversation, other than to remark on enemy movement. Less than a half hour after my appearance, a Russian attack surged toward our position, moving across the dense brush that occupied no man's land. Instantly, the alert gunner began to pour a non-stop fusillade across our front. Calling back a fire mission, I requested our 75mm guns to drop shells in a curtain roughly 25 yards in front of our position, as close as I dared risk. With the Red Army troops still closing on our location, I added my MP-40 submachine gun's fire to the torrent of bullets spilling from my comrade's machine gun. Despite the absence of any return fire and the lack of any clearly visible targets in the thick foliage, the gunner and I raked our weapons over the entire field in front of us as shells from our heavy guns began to slam down in support. When the barrel of the MG-42 finally overheated from the relentless firing, the soldier yanked it off and tossed it into a puddle next to us, producing a cloud of steam. Locking a fresh barrel into the machine gun, he started blazing away again. Already the gunner stood in a mound of empty shell casings. Perhaps half an hour passed with no let-up in our fire. Upon emptying my third or fourth 32-round clip, I again ducked down behind the wooden walls in order to avoid exposing myself as a target during the 15 seconds it took to reload another magazine into my weapon. At that moment, I became aware that the machine gun had grown silent, but assumed that the gunner was also reloading or again switching the barrel of his weapon. A glance to my right revealed the gunner crumpled on the ground beside me. A second later, I spotted blood running from a hole in his temple just under the rim of his helmet. The shot that killed him had not been audible in the din of combat, but its precision made it instantly obvious to me that it came from a sniper's rifle. There is not much time to contemplate one's fate in the middle of a battle, but the thought flashed through my mind that it could have been me lying there with a bullet through my head, if I had not ducked down or my submachine gun's magazine had run out a few seconds later. Crouching to keep my body hidden beneath the log fortifications, I sprinted over to the next infantry position 15 yards away to alert them to the loss of their machine gun support in that sector. While any regular infantryman would have had to hold his position and continue fighting, my latitude of movement as forward observer allowed me to depart that vulnerable area of the line and escape the fate of my unknown comrade. On June 28th, the relentless struggle at the Volkov ended in a German victory 3.5 months after our arrival. The Wehrmacht's High Command reported that German forces captured approximately 33,000 Red Army prisoners, 650 artillery pieces, 170 tanks, and 3,000 machine guns. Among those taken prisoner was General Vlasov, who eventually would lead units comprised of captured Russian troops who agreed to fight with Germany against the Soviet Union's communist government. Viewed as a traitor by the Russians, he was executed after the war. The German troops who went through the Volkov also suffered during the months of fighting. Indeed, the condition of those of us who survived was often little better than that of our enemy captives. My own weight dropped about 20 or 25 pounds to an emaciated-looking 160 pounds, but many other German soldiers endured far worse health problems. As I wandered over what had been the bitterly contested area of the Schlauch afterward, only a giant forest of stumps stretched to the horizon where the dense woods had once stood. The Soviet dead, or rather parts of their bodies, carpeted the churned-up ground. The stench was indescribably ghastly. The Battle of the Volkov had been a terrible struggle in almost unimaginably miserable conditions, but our success reinforced our belief that Germany would eventually prevail in the east. That summer, a new offensive in southern Russia offered us further hope that final victory was not far away. July 1st, August 11th, 1942. On July 1st, 1942, the 58th Infantry Division was transferred roughly 75 miles northwest to the perimeter of the Oranienbaum Kessel, roughly 15 miles west of our old position at Uritsk. The Soviet troops in this area had been cut off from the main body of Red Army forces further east during the previous summer's campaign, and were now surrounded in a large semicircular pocket with their backs to the Gulf of Finland. Although the division occupied roughly 15 miles of the front at Oranienbaum, the general lack of action offered us a relative respite from combat. Just after our arrival, the company commander presented me with the Infantry Sturmabzeichen Commendation for close combat. As was the case with many other medals, this was received for an accumulation of combat service rather than for a specific action. Although no major fighting took place at Oranienbaum, our heavy guns assisted in repulsing infiltration attempts by squads of Red Army soldiers about once a week. According to captured prisoners, the primary purpose of these raids was to seize one of our highly effective MG-42 machine guns that I had recently witnessed in action for the first time at the Volkhov. Raiding parties also crossed no man's land from our side, just as at Uritsk. Ranging in strength from 12-man squads up to rare 100-man units, these teams conducted reconnaissance of the enemy's positions and attempted to capture prisoners for intelligence purposes. When these forays took place, I remained in constant readiness to call upon our company's guns to protect their retreat in case they encountered trouble. In most situations, this support was not necessary, but our howitzers helped rescue the situation 2 or 3 times. Despite occasional fighting, the 2-month deployment at Oranienbaum permitted our division badly needed time to recuperate and receive replacements. Our 3.5 months of uninterrupted combat at the Volkhov had been unusual. In normal circumstances, troops engaged in intensive combat were permitted a rest after 3 or 4 weeks of heavy fighting. On a relatively inactive front, such as Oranienbaum, troops spent perhaps 80 or 90% of their time at the front. Despite rare rotations to the rear, we did sometimes have time to play a card game or write a letter in our bunkers. As in many other ways, our heavy weapons company was relatively better off than a regular infantry company in terms of the proportion of time that we spent on the front lines versus time in the rear. On August 1st, the Army promoted me to corporal, Unteroffizier. A week later, I was awarded the Winter Medal, which we referred to as the Frozen Meat Medal, for surviving the bitter cold that had killed so many. More importantly, I was granted a long overdue 3-week leave from duty on August 11th. Departing Oranienbaum, I set out on the roughly 1,000-mile journey back to Germany. Having last seen my family and Annalisa in November 1940, it was hard for me to believe that I was finally returning. While fighting in Russia, home had seemed 1,000,000 miles away. August 11th, August 30th, 1942. When we reached the border of the German Reich at Tilsit in East Prussia, the military authorities required everybody on board the train to undergo a thorough delousing. All our clothes and belongings were treated with steam in a large chamber, and we took long showers in hot water. Free of all pests, we proceeded into Germany. The sense of relief that I experienced upon getting out of Russia was overwhelming. When I finally arrived in Pugan 3 days after my departure from Oranienbaum, my family gave me an even warmer welcome than when I had arrived home the first time from Belgium. After 20 months away from home, my sisters had grown so much that they were almost unrecognizable to me, particularly my 5-year-old sister, Margaret. Playing with her was one of the highlights of my time at home. The welcome and treatment that I received from my family made me feel like a conquering hero. My mother even laid out a spread of specially prepared foods for me in a separate dining room, which the rest of my family envied. During my meals, my sisters sang a plaintive song just outside the door. Hear our quiet call for pastries for all. Even with the large number of German men now serving in the armed forces, soldiers continued to be treated with great respect by the public. Proud of my military service at the front, my mother encouraged me to put on my uniform before we left for a shopping trip in the nearby town of Salzwedel. Despite their best efforts, It was impossible to settle into the pleasant patterns of life with my family, as I had done after the French campaign. When a soldier came home from the war in Russia, he was a different person. At a certain level, the psychological strain of living in constant danger during combat lingered inside me. Though the old familiar routines of farm labour proved more therapeutic than my efforts to relax, it would ultimately take years to melt away the stress. Beyond this immediate tension, the fighting and killing had also perhaps affected my soul in ways that no amount of time would heal. While the farm itself remained unchanged from my youth, much had changed in Pugan. By this time, the German government had begun sending prisoners of war and conscripted civilians to work as labourers in the nation's factories and on its farms to replace manpower serving at the front. Following Poland's defeat in 1939, several Polish POWs had arrived at our village. These had been joined by a larger number of French and Belgian POWs the next year. As part of my family's continued targeting in retribution for its lack of support for the Nazi regime, local officials ordered my father, now a member of the Volkssturm, Home Guard, to serve as a guard for the village's 20 or so POWs. This duty required him to spend the night at the pub down the street from our house, since the prisoners were locked up at night in the pub's ballroom. Since my father was about 50 years old, he probably would have found it difficult to cope with an escape attempt. Fortunately, he generally got along well with the prisoners and never had any problems. One of the Belgian POWs later told my father, "Well, Herr Lübeck, you will not have to be a watchman very long. In the near future you will be the prisoner and we will be the guards." Under this labour programme, the local authorities provided my family with a Polish POW named Zygmunt, a factory worker from the Polish city of Lodz. Treating him as they would any German farmhand, my family worked beside him in the fields and never encountered any problems. Though government regulations stipulated that POWs should eat separately from German families, my mother ignored them and regularly set a place for Sigmund at our dining room table. Eventually, the authorities permitted the POWs to live out on the farms, if there was a space where they could be safely confined. Obtaining special permission, my family gave Sigmund a room in the Altental, my grandparents' former home. This positive experience with Sigmund was repeated later in the war with 2 Belgian POWs, whom the government supplied to my family as farm labour. Despite such changes, life in Pugan still appeared almost normal, and the war seemed far away for those not engaged in the fighting. In the middle of my 2-week visit with my family, I departed Pugan on August 21st to see Anneliese in Hamburg. Despite the passage of 2 years since we had last spent any significant time together, our increasingly frequent exchange of letters had brought us closer, though she still remained engaged to the florist's son. Arriving in Hamburg, I met Anneliese not far from the florist shop in the arcade across the Ulster River from City Hall, where she had been working since leaving her position at the shop in the city's main train station earlier that spring. In the half a day that followed, we quickly recaptured the intimacy of our early relationship as we talked and strolled around the city. Our time together was everything that I had imagined while I had been frozen in the snow at Uritsk and mired in the mud at the Volkov. From the moment I saw Anneliese again, I began to think seriously for the first time that she would make a wonderful wife, even if she was engaged to someone else. Unable to conceal my sentiments, I told her, "I am sorry, I do not want to interfere. But I still love you." What she chose to do was her decision, but it was important to me that she understood my feelings for her. Just before I boarded the train to return to Pugan for the remaining week of my leave, Anneliese handed me a gold cloverleaf talisman, promising it would bring me good luck. Placing the gift in the breast pocket of my tunic, I felt confident that it was only a matter of time before we would get back together. Yet we both now recognized that a soldier's fate on the battlefield was very uncertain. Even with the widespread optimism over the German advances toward the Volga and the Caucasus that summer, it was clear that many soldiers would not be coming home to their loved ones. By the time of my return from my 3-week furlough at the beginning of September, part of the 58th Division had been transferred about 70 miles south of Leningrad to a position on the north shore of Lake Ilmen, located only about 15 or 20 miles south of the Volkov battlefield. When I reached my company, it had taken up quarters in deserted Russian homes on the southern outskirts of the ancient Russian city of Novgorod. Our mission to help guard the far northern coast of Lake Ilmen against any potential amphibious operations from the Soviet-held eastern shore was a relatively easy assignment. Even if the Russians somehow managed to conduct a surprise amphibious landing in company or battalion strength, the natural defensive advantages of our position made us confident we could easily push them back into the water before they were able to establish a secure foothold. We remained vigilant, but there was little genuine concern about an attack. On October 15th, the 154th Infantry Regiment was redesignated the 154th Grenadier Regiment. This change nominally reflected the augmentation of its overall firepower through an increase in heavy weapons such as machine guns and large mortars. In reality, any increase in firepower could not fully compensate for the regiment's attrition of manpower that had reduced our overall strength by at least a battalion. Retaining a strong sense of pride in our unit, we saw little significance in the redesignation. Despite our continued regular training exercises, our assignment to a quiet sector permitted us more time to relax. While the weather remained warm enough, some of us laid beside the shore of Lake Ilmen. It almost felt like an extension of my leave, as I sat in the sun reading letters from home. Following my visit to Hamburg, the pace of my exchange of correspondence with Annalisa had increased. Within weeks, I received the news that I had been hoping for. Annalisa had decided to break off her engagement and build a relationship with me. Ironically, having just won back her heart, I proceeded to lose the gold cloverleaf charm she had given me for luck. Though Novgorod was just a 15-minute walk from our position, I only once ventured into the city to wander its deserted streets. Typical of most Soviet communities, it was mainly filled with small wooden shacks and plain concrete buildings. Only the large bronze sculptures located in the central plaza near the town's city hall made a favourable impression on me. My visit to one of the city's onion-domed churches, so characteristic of Russia, presented a mixed picture. While its exterior remained relatively intact, the church's dilapidated interior had been used to store grain or beets. This sacrilegious vandalism reinforced my view of the communists as barbaric atheists who posed a grave danger to Europe's Christian civilization. Meanwhile, other soldiers from my regiment took advantage of our location on the lake to go fishing. Instead of using rods or nets, they would toss standard kilo-sized blocks of explosives into the water, causing stunned or dead fish to rise to the surface for easy retrieval. In a tragic incident, 4 soldiers fishing this way were killed when they accidentally blew up their own boat. Even during the quietest moments in Russia, death never seemed far away. Demyansk, November 1942, February 1943. As part of its general counter-offensive in the winter of 1941-1942, the Red Army had staged an assault against German lines south of Lake Ilmen. By early February, the enemy had succeeded in isolating our units holding the areas around Demyansk, forcing the troops there to be supplied by air. In late April, the Wehrmacht counterattacked and forced through an overland route to the isolated troops, but the roughly 4-mile-wide and 7.5-mile-long supply corridor remained precarious. At the end of November 1942, the 58th Infantry Division joined other German divisions transferring south of Lake Ilmen to help protect this vital but still vulnerable land bridge to the Demyansk pocket. With another Russian winter already upon us, our division moved into an area just above the Polar River along the north side of the Schlauch in the hilly terrain known as the Valdai Heights. However, as was usually the case, most of us lacked any knowledge of our geographic location and were only aware of our immediate tactical situation. The fighting at Demyansk remained fairly constant, though in our area it lacked the intensity of what we had endured at the Volkhov. In resisting several large assaults and frequent smaller raids against our lines by the Red Army, we sometimes yielded or seized ground in tactical retreats or advances, but the front lines remained relatively stable. While these operations were of much greater consequence, it was the small personal encounters that most stood out for me. Reaching our newly assigned post on a low ridge along this corridor My communications specialist and I joined a group of other soldiers in a large bunker near the front that served as the living quarters. Because it was impossible to dig out an underground bunker or trenches in the frozen, rock-hard earth, it had been constructed above ground with snow camouflaging the log walls. A snow wall facing the Russian lines offered additional protection. Nearby there was also a small observation tower. In spite of our efforts to create a secure position, we soon began to be plagued by sniper fire from a Soviet sharpshooter. Fearful of getting hit, we were forced to remain inside the confined space of the bunker during the daylight hours. After this situation had persisted for several days, I finally grew frustrated and decided to do something about it. Grabbing a Mauser rifle, I made my way from our bunker to the snow rampart. Crouching down on my knees, I carved out a small aperture through the wall with my hands. Scrutinizing the winter landscape, there was nothing that gave away the location of the enemy sharpshooter. Suddenly, a shot burst through the snow wall, passing just over the top of my helmet. Accepting my defeat in our brief duel, I pulled my rifle from the hole and quickly ducked back into our bunker. As far as I was concerned, we would have to learn to live with the threat of the sniper. Soon afterward, I was surveying the enemy lines from the observation tower when I observed a Russian soldier walking out in the open through the snow about 500 yards away from our position. As I shouted down a fire mission, an infantryman aimed a small 50mm mortar and dropped a round into the tube. When the shell impacted about 50 feet from the Russian, he appeared to be startled. Suddenly realizing his perilous situation, he took off running through the deep snow and never stopped. Despite the gauntlet of fire created by the half-dozen mortar rounds falling around him, he somehow escaped unharmed. Sometimes war seemed more like a harmless game rather than the deadly struggle it really was. My turn as the quarry would come a few weeks later at another frontline bunker, located perhaps a mile from our previous position. The morning after my arrival there, I awoke to discover an overnight snowfall had built upon previous accumulations to leave a powdery cushion a foot deep. Leaving the bunker with a field telephone, I trudged a short distance through the picturesque winter landscape until I reached a good observation point. Concealed by my white camouflage, I remained standing in order to better survey the surrounding terrain. Without even lifting my binoculars, a quick scan of the enemy position immediately revealed a couple of Red Army bunkers. Protruding 6 feet above ground, the structures were plainly visible from my position less than 100 yards away. Though fresh snow now partially covered the layer of protective earth piled onto the bunkers, they appeared to be of recent construction and clearly posed a direct challenge to our control of the area. Selecting the closer and larger of the two, I called back firing coordinates to one of our 150mm howitzers, requesting a single round on the roughly 30-square-foot target. In a couple of minutes, an explosion threw up a cloud of snow about 20 yards to the left of the bunker. After adjusting the distance and direction, the second round landed 10 yards to the right. Advancing a little closer to better observe the target, I made a further correction and requested a delayed fuse. This round found its mark. Just after it smashed through the roof of the bunker, there was a loud whoosh of air as the shell with the delayed fuse detonated inside the structure a second later. The only thing observable externally was a little white smoke that drifted out through the roof. Before I could call back the targeting coordinates for the second bunker, enemy mortar rounds suddenly began bursting in the snow around me. Despite my camouflage, a Soviet observer had somehow spotted me during the 20 minutes that had passed. Now I was the prey. Moving clumsily through the snow, I headed for cover in our bunker a dozen yards away. Just over halfway to the entrance, a shell exploded right behind me. I felt a rush of air, but the deep snow partially absorbed the force of the blast, probably sparing me from serious injury. Gaining the relative safety of our bunker, I asked an infantry soldier inside whether I had been hit. Examining the back of my padded jacket, he confirmed that it was perforated with tiny holes caused by metal splinters from the mortar round. During the next half hour, he painstakingly removed the small shrapnel fragments from my skin. Once again, I had been lucky to avoid more serious injury. Because the precision involved in targeting enemy bunkers was a great challenge, It became my favorite task as forward observer. My success in knocking out perhaps a half-dozen of these structures over the previous year had earned me a reputation as a bunker-busting specialist inside the 13th Company. The destruction of the large bunker on the Demyansk corridor, however, had drawn me unwanted attention from the enemy. Around this time, the Red Army had begun to deploy loudspeakers on the front lines to spout propaganda and threats delivered in perfect German. Perhaps a week after my successful elimination of the bunker, a soldier from one of the regular infantry companies asked me if I had heard the Russians calling out my name over the loudspeakers. Replying that I had not, he informed me that these broadcasts were threatening me personally, announcing, "Lübecker, when we catch you, we'll cut off your nuts." Apparently, a captured German soldier had identified my role in destroying their bunker. From experience, I regarded this warning very seriously. In at least one recent instance, the Russians had castrated a sergeant and a corporal captured from one of our regiment's infantry companies. We discovered them the next day, dead from loss of blood. Such brutality reinforced our determination to avoid being taken prisoner by the Red Army at all costs, even if we had to take our own lives to escape that fate. This mentality was totally different than the mindset we possessed during the French campaign. If surrounded by French troops, I would have surrendered with confidence that I would be treated humanely. Realizing that the isolated position at Demyansk was a strategic liability, the Army's High Command began withdrawing equipment in early February 1943. On February 17th, it officially ordered the evacuation of the pocket to begin. Though under intense pressure from Soviet forces, the German Army conducted an orderly retreat. The 58th Infantry Division pulled out of the area on February 24th, March 1943. At the beginning of March 1943, our division returned to the north coast of Lake Ilmen to occupy a new defensive position near Novgorod, not far from where we had served the previous fall, guarding against potential amphibious operations. Now the thick winter ice covering Lake Ilmen provided a hard crust across which Russian forces could carry out land operations. In the weeks that followed, however, the Red Army's attacks across the frozen lake proved disastrous failures, because of our ability to spot their approach across the flat surface at a great distance. Even under the cover of darkness, the Soviets found it difficult to move across the ice, since we could illuminate the area with floodlights when we heard anything approaching. When the Russians made their attempts, the heavier artillery pounded them so effectively that they generally never even came within range of our company's guns, located a couple of miles from the shoreline. As the artillery shells shattered the lake's ice shell, men and equipment would slide into the freezing waters below. In a battalion-sized attack against the regiment positioned next to us, the Red Army employed a number of large motorized sleds, apparently intending to cross the frozen lake before our forces could react. This particular assault did succeed in reaching our lines, but the enemy was soon repulsed with heavy casualties. The relative security of our position at Novgorod allowed us a little time to relax. Among the German troops, perhaps the most readily embraced feature of Russian culture was the banya, bathhouse, typically built about 50 yards behind a Russian home. After steaming ourselves inside, we would exit the banya to cool ourselves in the snow. On one of these occasions, someone started a snowball fight. Still naked, we engaged in a running battle in the frozen winter landscape, momentarily forgetting the real war. Despite the Wehrmacht's successful evacuation of the Demyansk pocket to more defensible positions, and small tactical victories like those we achieved at Novgorod, our previously high morale slowly began to decline in 1943. For Army Group North, the war had definitively shifted to a defensive struggle to hold the gains achieved in 1941, while the Soviets now held the military initiative. We were also aware of the catastrophic fate of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, far to the south. After being encircled by the Red Army in November 1942, its survivors were finally forced to surrender in February. So great was the magnitude of the calamity that even Goebbels' propaganda ministry did not attempt to conceal it. Also, while the war in Russia took a mounting toll of casualties among German troops, our families back home began to increasingly suffer from Anglo-American bombing raids. Yet, after 2 years of war, we remained deep inside enemy territory and maintained faith in Germany's ultimate triumph. Our experience at the front left us wholly convinced that our army was still superior in terms of both our troops and equipment. Our generals and other officers also retained our full confidence and gave us a tactical advantage on the battlefield. Furthermore, we believed that German industry would continue to supply us with qualitatively better weapons than those of the enemy. Even after Stalingrad, we believed that we could still win a defensive struggle by not losing. The Red Army would gradually exhaust itself in its bloody assaults against us that produced only minor gains or no advantage at all. It seemed to me that the Soviet Union would eventually have to accept a negotiated peace that would leave Germany with much of its territorial gains. Just as Stalin controlled everything in the Soviet Union, Hitler held supreme power in Germany. Only after the war did it become clear to me that Hitler had engaged in a constant struggle against the Wehrmacht's general staff for control of military decision-making. As the war progressed, he increasingly subordinated the generals and the army to his whims. Unaware of Hitler's bungling and the political conflicts at the top, we never questioned the military decision-making until late in the war. Witnessing the skilled leadership exercised in the field, German troops at the front held the officer corps in high esteem. Yet even if tactical decisions by field officers remained unaffected, political meddling at the level of corps command or higher produced many poor strategic decisions. In the Red Army, the intervention of the communist political leadership in military operations was even more pervasive. Unlike the Wehrmacht, the Red Army installed politruks, political officers, down to the company level, and empowered them to make final decisions on lower-level tactical matters about how and where to fight. Although the Russians possessed many capable military officers well versed in military tactics, the presence of these politruks limited their effectiveness on the battlefield. This political interference largely explains Germany's tactical superiority. As the politruks gained more influence over military decisions later in the war, they caused the Red Army a lot of unnecessary casualties. Based upon my experience in combat and the intelligence we obtained from captured enemy troops, I would judge that perhaps a quarter of the Red Army casualties can be blamed on the interference of the politruks. It was also apparent to German troops at the front that the Soviet political leaders and officers regarded an ordinary soldier's life as a commodity without much value. They never hesitated to expend the lives of their men in operations that had a minimal chance of success. The Red Army sometimes, or possibly most of the time, fortified its troops with vodka to instill a sense of confidence in soldiers who often faced daunting odds. As we witnessed at the Volkhov, there were instances where a portion of the Red Army troops in an attack would even begin moving forward unarmed, with orders to retrieve weapons from those who were killed in the advance. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, would set up machine guns behind the attacking infantry to prevent any retreat. With no alternative, these troops would advance forward against our well-defended positions to be slaughtered or captured. If captured, the Russian soldier would generally continue to resist. Attempts to threaten a prisoner with a firearm during interrogations would frequently produce only a smile. Strangely, only the threat of a beating with a club or some similar weapon would tend to make the man fearful. In addition to the ethnically Slavic troops, growing numbers of Mongolians from the eastern parts of the Soviet Union began to appear in Red Army units after 1943. While not afraid of the typical Slav, we feared these Mongolians, who were especially tough and brutal adversaries in combat. At the start of the war, we often viewed and treated the Soviet soldier as a primitive brute. As we came to know the enemy, however, the natural courage and toughness of the Red Army soldier won him our respect. Whatever their views on communism, it soon became clear to us that the Russian troops were willing to sacrifice their lives to repel the German invaders who had occupied their motherland. Late March, April 24th, 1943. Though we still maintained our siege lines close to Leningrad, a Red Army offensive in January 1943 succeeded in opening an overland supply route into the city along the southwestern shore of Lake Ladoga. In mid-March, the Soviets began the Second Battle of Ladoga in another push against the German lines east of Leningrad. At the end of March, The 58th Infantry Division was pulled out of Novgorod and travelled some 60 miles north of Lake Ilmen to help bolster this threatened sector. When our division reached the front line near the town of Krasny Bor, just south of the Neva River, we were placed into a reserve position behind the Spanish Blue Division, which was fighting in Russia as a German ally. By this time, the 13th Company had gone through a couple of further changes in leadership. With 2nd Lieutenant Munsterman and his successor, 2nd Lieutenant Jürgens, both promoted to command battalions in our regiment, 2nd Lieutenant, Reichardt had now been placed in charge of our company. Perhaps in preparation for future promotion, Reichardt designated me to serve as the informal liaison between our heavy weapons company and the Spanish forces stationed in front of us. Beyond coordinating the use of our heavy guns to support the Spanish in case of a Soviet attack, I dealt with any other issues that might arise between our company and their division. There was a generally good relationship between the German and Spanish troops, but we felt uncertain about the Spanish soldiers' capability on the battlefield. Their heavy losses in the preceding months of combat in this sector reduced our confidence in their ability to resist a serious Red Army attack. When Soviet artillery fire began to pound the Spanish positions a couple of days later, our company immediately went to the support of the Spanish troops with our howitzers and recently issued 105mm mortars. Despite our best efforts, the Russian assault sent a portion of the Spanish troops reeling backward. In response to the crisis, our regiment's seasoned infantry quickly moved forward and counterattacked to prevent the initial enemy penetration from developing into a full-scale breakthrough. Within a couple of hours, our troops had forced the Red Army to retreat and had stabilized the front lines. In the weeks of relative quiet that followed, we were permitted some much-needed rest behind the front. As in other regions of Russia, the villages around Krasny Bor were mostly only a stretch of road with houses along either side. The Red Army had burned down many homes and villages during their scorched earth retreat early in the war, but a few structures close to our position remained intact. A group of us from my company were temporarily quartered in one of these surviving Russian homes for a few nights. Though normally billeted in unoccupied residences, in this instance we shared the small house with its residents, 2 women in their 30s or 40s and their children. In fact, these were the first Russian women I had seen since we had been stationed in Uritsk over a year earlier. As was usually the case with the Russian civilians we encountered, they appeared almost apathetic about our presence. During this period of relative quiet at Krasny Bor, a number of soldiers in my regiment made use of a nearby Russian banya to relax. This led to unexpected tragedy when soldiers from the Spanish Blue Division decided to engage in target practice with a machine gun in the same location. Opening fire, they accidentally killed all 4 Germans who had been relaxing inside the bathhouse. Although this incident naturally caused some bitterness toward the Spanish, most of us had grown so accustomed to death that we were almost desensitized. April 24th, May 15th, 1943. 3.5 weeks after our arrival at Krasny Bor, I received my second furlough from duty in Russia and departed on April 24th for the long trip home to Germany. Despite the warm welcome that I received from my family, coming home from the fighting in Russia remained a difficult experience. Over the first week or so, I could not connect to civilian life at all. During the day, my mind was still at the front as if I had never left. My nights were filled with dreams of combat. Only a couple of weeks into my leave did I slowly begin to readjust, but by then, of course, I had to return to the front. Still, whatever difficulties I experienced, it was always wonderful to be home. On May 8th, Annalisa came to Pugan for her first visit with my family. Since breaking off her engagement to the florist's son, our relationship had continued to grow more intimate. On walks around the farm, we talked about our future plans. Though marriage was still not imminent, it was already apparent to my family that eventually we would wed. Everyone in my family thought very highly of Annalisa. My sisters treated her like a sister, and my mother adored her. Only my father expressed any concern about our plans. He liked Annalisa personally, but had been trying to convince me that a man with my prospects could make a better marital connection by pursuing a woman from a wealthier background. His concern for my financial future reflected our own family's monetary difficulties during the Great Depression, but I did not agree with regarding marriage from a purely material point of view. Upset that he was attempting to meddle in what was a highly personal matter, I told him bluntly, "Dad, this is my decision. I love this woman and am going to marry her. You are not going to interfere." He never again questioned my judgment. At this time, Annalisa was still working at the flower shop across from Hamburg City Hall. However, the previous January, she had volunteered to enter training as a Red Cross nurse, feeling she had a patriotic duty to make a more direct contribution to the war effort. Shortly after her visit with us, she would start a 3-month training course at a hospital in Hamburg. As Annalisa headed back home and I set out on the journey back to the front on May 12th, we parted knowing that it was not only me who would soon be at risk. May 15th, July 24th, 1943. If readjustment to life at home was difficult for me, the separation from loved ones to return to the front was infinitely worse. As my train travelled down the miles of track, it was impossible not to dwell on the memories of Annalisa in my arms and the time spent together with my family, uncertain if I would live to see them again. Those first mid-May days back at the front at Krasny Bor were among the worst that I experienced as a soldier, especially since I was going directly into combat. Normally, the familiar pattern of trench warfare would again become my daily reality after about a week or so back at the front, but on this occasion my efforts to leave home behind failed. When a soldier's mind is focused on thoughts of home, he can become careless and highly vulnerable to injury or death. In an effort to compensate for my distraction, I sought to exercise an especially high level of caution during this period. Even though our lines at Krasny Bor shifted little, our company fought in a number of small and large actions against the enemy forces posted across from us. During this period, the Russians would sometimes stage attacks that seemed designed to acquire our food supplies as much as to occupy our positions. When the Soviet troops broke into our trenches, we would often fall back a couple of 100 yards while they went into our bunkers to pilfer our food stocks. With time to regroup, we would organize a counterattack that threw them back out of our positions, almost as if we were operating on a tacitly agreed schedule. Of course, some days stand out. On Sunday, June 17th, I turned 23. Normally, birthdays at the front received little recognition. On this occasion, 2nd Lieutenant Reichardt, the company commander, took note of mine and presented me with a bottle of cognac. He also used the rare calm at the front to hold our first church service since the start of the war in Russia, almost 2 years earlier. Such respites from the conflict never lasted long. Sometimes the war would strike unexpectedly. As I was walking among some large trees behind our lines on a quiet day, I heard the distant boom of an enemy artillery piece. Keeping my ears tuned to the whistle of the incoming round, I suddenly realized that it was coming close, very close. Instantly flinging myself flat, I pressed my body down into the rain-soaked earth. In that brief moment, while I awaited its impact, life or death seemed equally possible. My ears had not deceived me. The shell landed only 3 or 4 feet away from my prone body, but fortunately plunged deep into the mud before detonating. Incredibly, the explosion left me covered with mire, but otherwise unhurt. Even when we slept, combat often filled our dreams. One night I came partially awake in our bunker, mistakenly believing in my still semi-conscious state that we were under enemy attack. Snatching a hand grenade, I yelled, "The Russians are coming!" Fortunately for me, my communications specialist was fully alert and managed to yank the grenade from my hand before the pin was removed. Because we were down in a bunker, there was no way I could have gotten rid of it in time. In that confined space, the blast would have killed us both. Even though my assistant was my subordinate, rank mattered little in such a situation. At that moment, he was simply a comrade who was looking out for me, just as I would look out for him. As the weeks at the front passed, my time at home came to seem like a far-off dream, though Annalisa remained constantly in my thoughts. For her 22nd birthday on June 29th, I arranged to have a dozen red roses sent to her. It was as much an expression of my hope for our future together as it was a token of my deep affection. While my correspondence to her was mostly devoted to expressing my feelings, I would sometimes make passing mention of our combat operations in terms that would pass the censor's scrutiny. In a letter to Annalisa on June 20th, I referenced a duel between our howitzers and Soviet artillery. Writing on July 10th, I noted that our howitzers and mortars had successfully repulsed an assault by the Russians against our position. Such engagements were routine for us and otherwise soon forgotten. July 24th, September 4th, 1943. On July 22nd, the Red Army initiated the Third Battle of Ladoga, renewing its struggle to break the German siege lines east of Leningrad in the area close to the lake. 2 days later, our division was rushed the 15 miles from the Krasny Bor sector to a key position beside the Neva River, in an area known as the Sinyavino Heights. This placed us about 4 miles southeast of Lake Ladoga and 3 miles northwest of the critical rail junction of MGA. The 58th Division soon experienced some of its heaviest fighting of the war, as the Soviet 67th Army attempted to seize the high ground from us. The struggle on August 4th was particularly brutal. The 154th Regiment's attempt to regain the ground it had lost had to be broken off after the counterattack met with stiff enemy resistance and heavy losses. On August 8th, we experienced more tough fighting that tied me down in a foxhole for hours. On a generally quiet day a short time later, a strange episode occurred as I was tramping along a dirt road on the way from my front-line position to my rear bunker about a mile behind the front. As I approached the area just behind our howitzers, a young German second lieutenant wearing an unsoiled uniform came strolling up the road toward me from the north. This immediately struck me as odd, since the German army had no units located in that direction. While I was baffled by his presence in the area, the officer did not appear nervous or exhibit any suspicious behavior. As we passed one another, he cordially returned my salute, and I dismissed my apprehensions. 2 hours later, Soviet heavy artillery slammed 50 or 60 shells into our position with pinpoint accuracy. Only our deeply dug set of entrenchments prevented the bombardment from causing any casualties or damage to the howitzers. Instantly, my mind flashed back to the mysterious German officer. In retrospect, I concluded that he must indeed have been a Russian agent gathering intelligence. His close-up scouting of our position would explain the enemy's ability to target our camouflaged positions so precisely. Convinced of my failure to identify a spy, I silently vowed to be far more wary of anything unusual in the future. On an afternoon a few days later, I headed up to the front line to join my close comrade Sergeant Schutter, who had begun interchanging with me as our company's FO. Becoming suspicious about the unusual quiet that followed the recent artillery attack, he warned me that the Red Army might be preparing another assault. Deciding to study the enemy position myself, I climbed up the branches of a pine tree at the edge of the forest about 100 yards behind our trenches. In case any targets appeared, I hauled along a field telephone. Perhaps half an hour after I reached my perch about 20 feet up, 4 Soviet T-34 tanks suddenly appeared from the northeast and began a slow advance across the flat ground directly toward my location in the tree. Soldiers were riding on top of the tanks, which were followed by a large number of additional infantry on foot. While our company's heavy guns were not designed to serve in an anti-tank role and lacked armor-piercing rounds, I knew from long experience that it was possible to accurately target the fire of the guns into an area about 10 square yards in size. With a chance to halt the advance before it progressed any further toward our regiment's position, I used the field telephone to direct one of our 150mm guns to fire a round against the closest T-34, about 500 yards to my front. Falling just to the left of the target, the first shell's blast knocked the enemy troops from the tank, but failed to damage the vehicle. After redirecting the howitzer to shift its fire to the right, the next round fell short of the tank. The third shell landed very close, missing the T-34 by only a few feet. Receiving a further correction, the gun crew fired a fourth round. When the shell detonated against the turret, the tank instantly ground to a halt. Seconds later, a small plume of white smoke began to drift from the vehicle. Shifting my attention to a second T-34 about 20 yards behind the destroyed one, I called in a fifth round. Smashing into its treads from the side, the shell's explosion immobilized the vehicle, forcing its crew to jump out and run for cover. The third Soviet tank in the group immediately ceased its advance, while the fourth one began to retreat. As this assault ended, a larger group of around 15 tanks momentarily came into view 1,000 yards behind the scene of the attack before moving out of sight behind a hill. Unsure whether this larger armoured force would renew the advance, I telephoned back to headquarters to make our new regimental commander, Colonel Oberst Hermann Heinrich Behrend, aware of the situation. "Where are you?" he demanded before I could even speak. "I am in a tree right behind the front line," I responded with some trepidation. "What the hell are you doing up there?" he yelled back, obviously concerned that I would place myself in such a vulnerable position. Informing him that we had stopped an armoured attack probing our defences, I warned that significant tank forces were massing behind it and might conduct another assault. After requesting details on the number of tanks and their location, he indicated that he would pass along the intelligence to divisional headquarters and then hung up. Once their initial thrust had been halted, the Soviets did not, however, attempt to renew their attack on our sector of the front. Despite my thrill at knocking out the tanks, there was still a danger that the enemy would spot me the longer I remained in my exposed position. Yet climbing down the tree in the daylight would greatly increase the risk of attracting the attention of a Russian sniper or machine gun crew. In this dilemma, my only choice was to wait for the cover of darkness. When dusk finally fell about an hour later, I made a rapid slide down the trunk and headed for safety in the rear. Reaching the gun crew, I passed along news of our small triumph. In a war filled with many combat engagements, hitting a moving target with indirect fire from guns in the rear was a rare and memorable accomplishment. Over the course of the war, most of the casualties in our regiment resulted from Russian artillery and mortars, to a lesser extent from small arms fire. About this time, however, we also began to endure our first bombing and strafing raids by Soviet aircraft. During the daytime, we occasionally faced a threat from Soviet ground attack planes, like the Ilyushin II Sturmovik. At night, we confronted the menace of the Polyakov II, nicknamed the Namashine, sewing machine, for the loud rhythmic clattering of its engine. The noisy approach of the Namashine was audible at a great distance, but it was virtually impossible to target them in the darkness. Flying a couple of 100 feet overhead, the pilot and co-pilot would search for any flicker of light that would reveal the location of our lines or rear camps. Despite efforts to black out everything on the ground, there was bound to be someone who would light a cigarette or use a flashlight that the enemy could spot. Once locating a potential target, the Soviet pilots often cut their engines in order to glide silently over the spot before dropping their bombs on the unsuspecting targets below. The day after one of these nocturnal raids by a Namashine, not long after the tank battle, I was again up front operating as forward observer. Immediately after directing one of our 150mm howitzers to fire a round against an enemy target, I instead heard an enormous boom from the direction of our heavy guns in the rear. The mystery was soon revealed. A misfiring shell inside the barrel of the howitzer had caused an explosion that detonated the shells stacked next to it, killing the 5-man gun crew and obliterating everything in the vicinity. Though unable to get back and observe the scene myself, I was told that only a large crater remained. This malfunction could have resulted from faulty workmanship or sabotage in the manufacture of the shell, but I was convinced it resulted from the phosphorus dropped on our position during the previous night's air raid. A corrosive particle of the phosphorus could have burned a small hole in a shell that went undetected during its loading. Unfortunately, a sudden change in the battlefield situation within hours of this accident forced my company to pull back from the position without conducting an adequate investigation. Earlier combat in the area of the Leningrad siege had primarily involved stationary trench warfare similar to that experienced on the Western Front in the First World War. In contrast, the combat near the Neva was more fluid and more bloody. Frequently there were sudden shifts in the front lines, as both sides in turn retreated and counterattacked. As always, the 13th Company experienced a much lower casualty rate than the 154th Regiment's regular infantry companies. since the majority of our personnel served in the rear handling our heavy weapons. Even though my assignment as forward observer placed me on the front line, my freedom to avoid or pull out of more hazardous areas gave me a significant advantage over the regular infantry, as the earlier incident with the sniper at Volkov demonstrated. Back in Germany, where Annalisa was completing her nursing training, she and other civilians had begun to experience firsthand the horror of war. Frequent Allied air raids by large bomber formations now often forced her and the other members of her household to take refuge in the basement of her father's home in Hamburg. At the end of July 1943, I heard on the radio that the Allies were repeatedly targeting Hamburg with powerful airstrikes. Employing hundreds of planes in the first of a series of massive area bombings of German cities, the enemy dropped large numbers of incendiary bombs that ignited multiple blazes. Heat and strong winds soon whipped these into a firestorm of unprecedented scale that killed about 40,000 people and devastated much of the central part of city. In the aftermath of the attack, all mail to Hamburg stopped for a couple of weeks, leaving me deeply concerned. A long 3 weeks later, I received word that Annalisa and her family had survived. By the time her letter reached me, Annalisa had meanwhile completed her basic nursing training and been transferred up to a hospital at St. Peter-Ording on the North Sea coast, a location where she would be much safer. Composing a letter to Annalisa, I conveyed both our difficult conditions at the front as well as my concerns for her. We are in the most northern part of the Eastern Front on a large river, the Neva. We are in foxholes and life is really miserable. We don't get any sleep. I await a letter from you concerning the bombing of Hamburg on 25th and 26th of July, 1943. It would be months later before I learned what she had personally experienced. Despite the hardships in Russia, I still expressed an abiding optimism about the outcome of the conflict. We don't have very much of our younger years left to us, but this will change when the war is finished. We here on the front are very positive that we will win the war. My words also sought to reassure her by painting a brighter future for us after the fighting had ended. All that we are going through now will be compensated by our mutual love. After our victory, we will make up for all these missing moments and hours.